I still remember the exact moment my future daughter-in-law's mother looked me in the eye and asked with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, "And how exactly do you plan to support yourself without becoming a burden to our family?" The table went quiet. My son Daniel stared at his plate. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I smiled, softly, nervously, like I didn't quite understand the weight of what had just been said, because that's exactly what I wanted them to believe. Before I go on, tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place? Would you have spoken up or stayed quiet like I did? If this story already has you feeling something, take a moment to like and subscribe and share where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd really love to know. I didn't always look like someone people could dismiss so easily. There was a time when rooms went quiet for a very different reason. When I walked in, people paid attention. Not because of what I wore, but because of what I knew, because of what I controlled. My name is Crystal Collins. I'm 67 years old, a widow, and if you were to judge me the way the Harpers did that night, you'd probably assume I lived a small, uneventful life, tucked quietly into the background of my son's world. That assumption would be very, very wrong. But I worked hard to make it believable. After my husband, Michael Collins, passed away 8 years ago, everything in my life changed, at least on the surface. Michael wasn't just my partner in life, he was my partner in business. Together, we had built something from nothing. What started as a modest financial consulting practice had over 3 decades grown into a powerful investment firm that quietly managed portfolios for people who preferred discretion over headlines. We were never flashy, never loud, but we were very, very good at what we did. And when Michael died, people expected me to sell, to step down, to disappear in the way widows often do, gracefully, quietly fading into the margins of the story. Instead, I stayed just long enough to make sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. I sold my shares at the perfect time. I secured long-term investments that would outlive me. I restructured everything so that control remained in my hands, even if my name no longer appeared on any public documents. And then I stepped away. Not because I had to, because I chose to. I traded tailored suits for soft cardigans, boardrooms for a small sunlit home in a quiet neighborhood. I stopped correcting people when they underestimated me. I stopped explaining myself altogether. There's a certain kind of freedom in being overlooked. People reveal more when they think you're harmless, especially family. Daniel never fully understood that part of me. To him, I was just Mom, the one who packed his lunches, who stayed up late helping him study, who sat in the stands at every soccer game, even when it rained. He saw the long nights. Of course, he knew I worked hard, but I made sure he never felt the weight of what we were building. Michael and I agreed on that early. Our son deserved a childhood untouched by pressure, by expectations tied to money. So we kept things simple, even when they weren't. By the time Daniel was old enough to ask questions, the firm was already thriving. By the time he went to college, we had more than enough to secure not just his future, but the futures of generations we would never meet. And still, I never sat him down and said, "This is what we have." Because I didn't want him to become the kind of man who measured people the way the Harpers did. Ironically, that silence may have made him more vulnerable to them. After Michael died, Daniel worried about me. Of course he did. I was suddenly alone, and from his perspective, I had retired. He didn't see the accounts, the structures, the quiet streams of income that continued to grow without any effort on my part. He saw a woman living alone in a modest house, driving an older car, shopping with coupons, not because I needed them, but because I never stopped valuing simplicity. "Mum, are you sure you're okay?" He used to ask, his voice soft with concern. "I'm more than okay," I would tell him, and I meant it, but I never elaborated. That was my choice. And choices, as I've learned, always come with consequences. When Daniel introduced me to Vanessa Harper, I wanted to like her. I truly did. She was polished, articulate, and came from a family that at first glance seemed successful and well established. Richard Harper ran a mid-sized real estate development company. Eleanor Harper moved through social circles like she owned them. They were the kind of people who understood appearances, the kind of people who curated their lives carefully. At first, Vanessa was warm to me. She called me Crystal instead of Mrs. Collins, which I appreciated. She asked polite questions, laughed at the right moments, and seemed genuinely invested in building a connection. But there were small things, tiny shifts in her expression when she visited my home. The way her eyes lingered on the worn edges of my furniture, not with appreciation, but with quiet judgment. The subtle pause when I mentioned I preferred staying in rather than attending large events. At the time, I brushed it off. People notice differences. It doesn't always mean anything. But then she invited me to dinner with her parents, and everything changed. That night, sitting at their perfectly set table, under warm lighting that somehow still felt cold, I watched them assess me. Not openly, not rudely, but precisely, like I was a variable they hadn't accounted for, like I was a risk. And when Eleanor asked her question, "How exactly do you plan to support yourself?" It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. They wanted to know if I would cost them something, if loving me would require sacrifice, if I would become inconvenient. So I gave them exactly what they expected: a small, uncertain smile, a soft laugh. "Oh, I manage," I said, gently folding my hands in my lap. "I don't need much." It was the truth, just not the truth they thought it was. I watched Daniel that night more than I watched anyone else. I saw the discomfort in his posture, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he didn't challenge them. And that hurt more than Eleanor's question ever could, because silence in moments like that isn't neutral, it's permission. Still, I didn't blame him. Not then. Daniel had always been kind, but he wasn't used to confrontation. He wanted peace. He wanted everyone to get along. And the Harpers. They knew exactly how to use that. By the end of the evening, something inside me had shifted. Not broken, not yet, but sharpened. I had spent a lifetime reading people, understanding motives, predicting behavior based on subtle patterns most would miss. And what I saw in that dining room wasn't just arrogance, it was strategy. They weren't just judging me, they were positioning themselves, testing boundaries, deciding how much influence they could exert not just over Daniel, but over the shape of his future, and by extension, over me. That was the moment I made a decision, not out of anger, not even out of pride, but out of clarity. If they believed I was weak, I would let them believe it. If they thought I was naive, I would play the part. Because people are most honest when they think they're safe from consequences. And I wanted to see just how far the Harpers would go when they thought no one was watching. I just didn't expect how far Daniel would go with them, or how much it would cost me to find out. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's this: people rarely show you who they are all at once. They reveal themselves in layers, subtle, deliberate, often disguised as politeness. And the Harper family, they were masters of that art. After that first dinner, I told myself I might have been too sensitive, that perhaps Eleanor's question had simply been poorly phrased, that maybe Richard's tone had sounded colder than he intended, that Vanessa's silence had come from discomfort, not agreement. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, but benefit of the doubt, I've learned, is something you should give carefully and never repeatedly without reason. The second time I saw them was at their home. Vanessa had invited me over for what she called a small family brunch. Daniel encouraged me to go. "It'll be more relaxed this time, Mum," he said with a hopeful smile. "They just want to get to know you better." I smiled back at him. "Of course, sweetheart." But something in his tone lingered with me, hopeful, as if he needed things to go well, not just wanted them to. The Harper home was exactly what I expected, and yet somehow even more intentional. Large but not ostentatious. Every detail curated to signal wealth without appearing to try too hard. Neutral tones. Expensive textures. Art that looked effortless but was almost certainly chosen with precision. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. And the moment I stepped inside, I knew I was being evaluated again. Crystal Eleanor greeted me, her smile perfectly measured. So glad you could make it. Her eyes moved quickly over my outfit, a soft beige cardigan, simple blouse, comfortable slacks. Nothing remarkable. That was the point. Thank you for having me, I said gently. Richard gave a polite nod from across the room. Vanessa approached with a light hug, though I noticed how quickly she stepped back as if careful not to linger. Come sit, Eleanor said, gesturing toward the dining area. The table was already set. Of course it was. Everything about this family operated on preparation. We sat. And once again, the conversation began harmlessly enough. Weather, travel, a recent charity event Eleanor had attended. Daniel tried to include me. Mom makes the best lemon pie, he said at one point, smiling. Oh, Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Do you bake often, Crystal? I smiled. Sometimes I enjoy it. There was a pause, not long but noticeable. Simple pleasures, Eleanor said, taking a sip of her coffee. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, as if simplicity were something one settled for, not something one chose. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me in a way that felt far more direct than before. So, Crystal, he began, his tone casual. Daniel mentioned, you've been retired for a while now. Yes, I replied softly. And before that, he asked. I hesitated just long enough to seem unsure. Oh, I worked in finance, I said, keeping my voice light. Nothing too exciting. Richard's lips curved just slightly. Finance can mean a lot of things. I gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh. Mostly administrative work, supporting roles, not a lie. Just not the full truth. Vanessa glanced at me briefly, then looked down at her plate. I caught the flicker in her expression. Disappointment. That was the moment I knew, whatever she had hoped I would be, I wasn't it. And that mattered to her more than she had let on. Well, Eleanor said, setting down her cup, it must be nice to live without too much pressure. There it was again. That wordless implication that my life lacked significance. I've been very fortunate, I said simply. And I meant that too. Fortunate enough not to need to prove anything to anyone, but they didn't see it that way. To them, I was a woman who had done little, achieved little, and now existed on the edges of her son's life, waiting perhaps to be taken care of. And the more I allowed them to believe that, the more comfortable they became. The conversation shifted again, this time toward Daniel and Vanessa's future. We've been discussing neighborhoods, Vanessa said, her tone brightening. Somewhere closer to the city. It makes more sense for work. Daniel nodded. It's still early, but yeah, we've been looking. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely happy for him. Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Richard. Subtle, but intentional. And of course, Eleanor added, you'll want to think long-term. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Well, she said lightly, family dynamics, space, independence. I felt it before she even finished the sentence. And ensuring, Richard added, his voice smooth, that everyone is comfortable in their own arrangements. There was a pause. Daniel shifted in his seat. Vanessa reached for her glass. And then Eleanor said it softly, almost kindly. It's important for young couples to establish their own lives without complications. Her eyes met mine briefly, then moved away. That was the first time they didn't even bother to disguise it. They weren't just evaluating me anymore. They were positioning me as something outside, something separate, something that would need to be managed. I lowered my gaze slightly, letting my shoulders relax just enough to suggest uncertainty. I understand, I said quietly. Young people need their space. Eleanor smiled, satisfied. Richard leaned forward just a little, as if closing a deal. I'm glad we're on the same page. But we weren't, not even close. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly see, was that every word they spoke, every glance they exchanged, every assumption they made, I was recording it all, not with a device, with memory, pattern, instinct. This wasn't new to me. I had spent years sitting across tables just like this, watching people underestimate me, watching them reveal more than they intended, watching them make decisions based on incomplete information. And I had learned one crucial lesson. The moment someone thinks they've figured you out is the moment they become predictable. By the time brunch ended, Eleanor walked me to the door. Crystal, she said gently, placing a hand on my arm, I do hope you know we only want what's best for Daniel and Vanessa. Of course, I replied, meeting her gaze with a soft smile. Stability is very important, she added. It is, I agreed. She studied me for a second longer, as if trying to determine whether I truly understood. I made sure she believed I did. As I stepped outside, I felt the cool air brush against my face, grounding me. Daniel followed me to the car. Mom, he said quietly, that went better, right? I looked at him, really looked at him, at the uncertainty in his eyes, at the way he was already trying to balance two worlds, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about him. I'm glad I came, I said gently. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough for him. As I drove away, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind was anything but. The Harpers had made their first real move. Not openly, not aggressively, but clearly. They were drawing lines, creating distance, shaping the future they wanted, one where I didn't quite fit, and they believed I would accept it. Because they believed I didn't have a choice. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake. Thinking I hadn't already started planning my response. What I didn't know yet was just how far they were willing to go, or how much Daniel would be willing to ignore before he finally saw what I saw. If the brunch had been subtle, the next dinner was not. It was Vanessa who invited me again, this time to a restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the lighting is dim, the prices are not listed openly, and every detail is designed to remind you exactly how much you don't belong. Unless you do. Daniel sounded hopeful when he called. Mom. I think this is good, he said. They just want everyone to feel comfortable. Comfortable? I almost smiled at that word. Still, I agreed. Because by then I understood something clearly, the more comfortable they felt, the more they would reveal. And I needed them to feel very comfortable. When I arrived, they were already seated. Eleanor looked elegant, as always, dressed in something understated but unmistakably expensive. Richard glanced at his watch as I approached, not impatient, just noting. Vanessa gave me a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel stood to greet me, pulling out my chair. Mum, he said softly. Thank you, sweetheart. I sat down, smoothing my cardigan, fully aware of how I must look in that room. Exactly as I intended. The waiter came, took orders, poured wine I didn't touch. Small talk followed the same careful dance of neutral topics, safe smiles, and measured tones. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to it, a purpose. I could feel it building beneath the surface like pressure waiting for release. It didn't take long. So Crystal Eleanor began, her voice warm but deliberate. We've been thinking a lot about Daniel and Vanessa's future. I nodded gently. That's natural. They're at a very important stage, Richard added. Decisions made now will affect everything later. Of course, I said. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her fingers laced together on the table. We want to make sure everything is clear, she said. Clear. That word again. I tilted my head just enough to appear uncertain. I'm not sure I understand. There was a brief pause, almost as if they were deciding how direct to be. Then Eleanor smiled. Well, let's speak openly, she said. It's better that way, don't you think? I gave a small, agreeable nod. Yes, honesty is always best. Richard set his glass down. We believe it's important for Daniel and Vanessa to have a strong financial foundation, he said, without external complications. There it was again, not even disguised this time. I lowered my gaze slightly, folding my hands in my lap. I would never want to complicate anything, I said softly. Eleanor reached out, placing her hand lightly over mine. I'm sure you wouldn't, she said, but sometimes circumstances do that for us. Her touch was gentle, her meaning was not. Vanessa took a breath as if steadying herself. There's also the matter of a prenuptial agreement, she said carefully. Daniel shifted beside me. Vanessa. No, it's okay, I said quietly, placing a light hand on his arm. It's reasonable. All three of them seemed to relax slightly. That told me everything I needed to know. They expected resistance, and they were relieved not to find it. Richard nodded. It's simply a precaution. Of course, I replied. Eleanor watched me closely now, and we would want to ensure that Daniel's future assets are protected. Protected from what? Daniel asked, a hint of tension in his voice. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. From any unexpected obligations, she said. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because this time they weren't just implying, they were stating it. I was the obligation, the potential burden, the risk. I let my shoulders sink slightly, just enough to suggest discomfort. I see, I said softly. You're worried I might need help someday. Vanessa hesitated, but only for a second. We just want to be realistic, she said. Realistic. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing something difficult. That makes sense, I murmured. Daniel turned to me, his brow furrowed. Mom, you don't... It's all right, I said gently, cutting him off. They're thinking about the future. That's a good thing. I could feel Eleanor studying me, searching for something, pride perhaps, or resistance. I gave her neither. Instead, I leaned into the role they had already written for me. I've never had much, I said quietly. I've always managed with what I have. That part was true, just not in the way they understood. Richard leaned back, clearly more at ease now. And we respect that, he said. But planning ahead avoids misunderstandings later. Of course, I said again. Vanessa exhaled tension, leaving her shoulders. And there's one more thing, she added. I looked at her, my expression open, patient. We've been talking about living arrangements, she said. After the wedding, Daniel stiffened slightly. Vanessa. It's important, she insisted gently. Eleanor stepped in smoothly. You see, Crystal, she said, we believe it's healthiest for young couples to establish independence early. I agree, I said softly. Another pause. Then Richard spoke more directly than before. That would mean separate households. Separate, clear, final. Daniel looked at me now, searching my face. For what, I wasn't sure. Reassurance, resistance, permission. I gave him none of those things, only a quiet smile. I wouldn't want to intrude, I said. And just like that, the decision was sealed, at least in their minds. Relief moved through the table like a wave, subtle but unmistakable. They had gotten what they wanted, or so they thought. The rest of the dinner passed more easily. Lighter conversation returned. Vanessa laughed more. Eleanor seemed almost warm. Richard spoke about future investments, travel plans, opportunities. And through it all, I listened, watched, learned. Because when people believe a problem has been resolved, they stop being careful. They speak more freely. They reveal more than they intend. By the time dessert arrived, I knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about distance. It was about control. They didn't just want me out of the way. They wanted influence over Daniel's life, his decisions, his finances, his future. And they believed removing me would make that easier. When the check came, Richard took it without hesitation. "Please," I said softly, reaching into my purse. "Let me contribute." It was a simple gesture, a polite one. But Eleanor shook her head almost immediately. "That's not necessary," she said. The way she said it so quickly, so dismissively, told me exactly how she saw me. Not as someone who couldn't afford to contribute, but as someone whose contribution didn't matter. I withdrew my hand slowly, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." As we stood to leave, Vanessa hugged Daniel first, then gave me a brief, careful embrace. "Good night, Crystal," she said. "Good night, dear." Outside, the air felt cooler than I expected. Or maybe it was just the contrast. Daniel walked me to my car again, just like before. He looked troubled. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. I turned to him, taking in his face the concern, the confusion. "I'm fine," I said gently. "That felt a little much," he admitted. I tilted my head slightly. "They care about you," I said. "That's not a bad thing." He hesitated. "Yeah, but Daniel," I said softly, placing my hand over his. "You're building a life. That comes with decisions." He searched my face again. "You're not upset?" I smiled. No, it wasn't a lie. Not exactly, because what I felt wasn't anger. It was clarity. As I got into my car and closed the door, I caught one last glimpse of him standing there, caught between loyalty and influence, between instinct and persuasion. And I realized something that settled deep in my chest. The Harpers weren't just testing me anymore. They were moving pieces. And Daniel, he didn't even realize he was one of them. I started the engine, my expression calm, my mind already working through the next steps. They thought the conversation tonight had been about boundaries, about protection, about keeping things simple, but they were wrong. What they had actually done was show me exactly how far they were willing to go. And now that I knew that I could finally decide just how far I was willing to go in return. That night after the dinner, I didn't turn on the lights when I got home. I didn't need to. The house was quiet in a way that felt familiar, almost comforting. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the living room, the same room Daniel had grown up in, the same space that had once been filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and the steady presence of Michael's voice. I set my purse down slowly and sat in my usual chair. And for the first time since meeting the Harpers, I let the silence stretch long enough for the truth to settle completely. They weren't just concerned, they weren't just cautious. They were calculating, and worse, they were confident. Confident that they had already figured me out. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, my fingers resting lightly against the armrest. My mind moved through every word spoken that evening, every glance exchanged, every carefully placed sentence. Prenuptial agreement, separate households, unexpected obligations. They had already defined me in their world, not as family, not as someone to be included, but as a variable to be managed, removed, contained. I closed my eyes for a moment, and unexpectedly uninvited, a memory surfaced. It wasn't recent. It was from years ago, before Daniel was even born. Michael and I had been younger then, still building our firm, still learning how to navigate rooms filled with people who believed we didn't belong there. I remembered one particular meeting, a long table, unfamiliar faces, a deal that would either establish us or shut us out completely. And I remembered how one man, older, polished, confident, had looked at me not with respect, but with quiet dismissal. "You're new to this level," he had said, his tone almost kind. "It's best to let more experienced people handle the negotiations." I had smiled, just like I smiled at Eleanor, soft, agreeable, unthreatening. Michael had known that smile. He had seen it enough times to recognize what it meant. It meant I was about to win. By the end of that meeting, the deal had shifted entirely in our favor, not because I argued louder, but because I listened longer. Because I let them believe they were in control. Because people, when they underestimate you, stop protecting themselves. I opened my eyes. The same principle still applied. Only now the stakes were different. This wasn't business. This was my son, and that made it far more dangerous. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. My hands were steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been all evening. There was a decision to be made. I could confront them, expose their intentions early, force Daniel to choose sides before things went any further. But that would only push him toward them, not away. People don't like being told they're being manipulated. They resist it. They defend the very thing that's hurting them. No, that wouldn't work. If I wanted Daniel to see the truth, he had to experience it. And if I wanted to understand exactly how far the Harpers were willing to go, I needed to give them space to go there. That meant one thing. I would have to become exactly who they thought I was, not just occasionally, completely. I set the glass down gently. All right, I murmured to myself, if that's the role you've chosen for me, then I'll play it better than you expect. The next morning, I began. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gestures, just small, deliberate changes. I wore my oldest clothes when I knew I would see them not worn out, but modest enough to reinforce their assumptions. I spoke more carefully, letting hesitation creep into my tone when finances were mentioned. I asked simple questions. Questions I already knew the answers to. What exactly is a prenup? I had asked Vanessa over coffee a few days later, tilting my head slightly, letting curiosity soften my voice. She blinked, clearly surprised. Oh, it's just a legal agreement, she said, to protect assets. Oh, I replied, nodding slowly. That sounds complicated. It's not really, she said quickly. It's just practical. Practical. That word again. I smiled gently. I trust you and Daniel to make the right decisions. The relief in her expression was immediate and telling. Another time when Daniel mentioned looking at houses, I hesitated just enough before speaking. I hope I won't be in the way, I said quietly. Mum, you're not in the way, he replied, though there was something uncertain in his tone. I just don't want to be a burden, I added softly. That word again, burden. I watched his face carefully. Conflict flickered there. Brief, but real. Good, I thought. Let that sit with you. Let it grow. Each interaction became a thread in a larger pattern. And slowly, predictably, the Harpers began to relax. Eleanor started speaking more openly around me. Not cruelly, not directly, but with less restraint. She's very dependent on you emotionally, I overheard her say to Daniel once, not realizing I was within earshot. Daniel didn't respond, but he didn't correct her either. Richard became more direct in his suggestions. Financial independence is important, he told Daniel during another visit, especially when others might rely on you. Others. Always others. Never me by name. Vanessa, however, changed the most. At first, she had been careful, measured in her interactions with me, but as my naivety became more convincing, her patience began to thin. She explained things to me more slowly, simplified conversations, repeated herself as if speaking to someone who couldn't quite keep up. Crystal, it's really not something you need to worry about, she said one afternoon when I asked about wedding expenses. We've got it handled. Handled, meaning not your place. I nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. Of course, I don't know much about these things. That was the moment she stopped trying to include me, and that more than anything told me the plan was working. But there was a cost. There's always a cost. Every time I softened my voice, every time I let a comment pass without correction, every time I watched Daniel hesitate and say nothing, it settled somewhere deep inside me, not anger, not yet, but something heavier, something quieter, disappointment. Because this wasn't just about the Harpers anymore, it was about the man my son was becoming in their presence, the man who avoided conflict, the man who chose peace over truth, the man who slowly was learning to see me the way they did. That realization hurt more than anything they could have said. Still, I stayed the course, because walking away now would mean never knowing how far they would go. And I needed to know, not just for myself, but for Daniel. Because if I intervened too soon, he would never see it clearly. And if I waited too long, I might lose him completely. That was the risk, and I accepted it. A week later, Vanessa called. Her voice was bright, carefully so. Crystal, we're hosting a small gathering next weekend, she said. Some close friends' family. We'd love for you to come. I paused just long enough. Oh, I don't want to impose, I said softly. You wouldn't be imposing, she replied quickly. But there was something in her tone, something rehearsed. We think it's important for everyone to feel included, she added. Included. Another word that didn't mean what it sounded like. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I'd be happy to come. Wonderful, she said. After we hung up, I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand. A gathering. Public. Carefully curated. I didn't know exactly what they had planned, but I knew this. It wasn't just a social event. It was a stage. And if I had learned anything about the Harpers, it was that they never did anything without a reason. I set the phone down slowly, my reflection catching briefly in the darkened screen. Soft expression, gentle posture, harmless, exactly what they expected. But behind that reflection, my thoughts were already moving, calculating, preparing. Because whatever they had planned for that gathering, I would be ready, even if they believed I wouldn't. Especially because they believed I wouldn't. The invitation to the Harper gathering sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I touched it again. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant letterings, a carefully worded message about close friends and family coming together to celebrate Vanessa and Daniel's upcoming engagement. Everything about it looked harmless, almost warm. But I've learned that warmth can be the most effective disguise. On the 4th day, I finally placed it back in my drawer, not because I was uncertain, because I was preparing. By then, I had already seen the pattern clearly enough to predict the next step. The Harpers were no longer testing me casually. They were shaping a narrative, and in that narrative, I was becoming smaller with every interaction, more dependent, more forgetful, more convenient to overlook. Daniel, meanwhile, was changing in ways he didn't fully recognize. It wasn't sudden. That's what made it harder to confront. It was subtle. A missed phone call here, a delayed response there, longer pauses when I spoke about my needs as if he was trying to decide whether they were reasonable or not. And always, Vanessa or Eleanor nearby when decisions were made. Influence rarely arrives loudly. It arrives consistently. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my house unannounced. He looked tired, not physically exhausted, but mentally divided, like someone carrying too many voices in his head. "Mum," he said as he stepped inside, "you don't have to come to every family thing they invite you to." I set down the tea I was preparing. "Oh?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "It's just... Vanessa thinks it might be easier if things stay simple right now, with the wedding planning and everything." Simple? That word again. I nodded slowly. "Of course. I don't want to make things difficult. That's not what I mean," he said quickly. "You're not difficult." But the fact that he felt the need to say it told me something had already shifted. "I understand," I replied softly. And I did, more than he knew. He looked relieved but also conflicted, as if he expected resistance that never came. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked again, softer this time. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, smiling gently. It was a practiced smile now, one I wore more often than I liked. After he left, I stood in the quiet kitchen longer than necessary. There's a specific kind of silence that follows conversations like that. Not peaceful, not calm, but reorganizing, like something in the relationship has quietly shifted and both sides are adjusting their balance without acknowledging it. I poured myself the tea I had started earlier and sat down. Vanessa was influencing him more directly now. That much was clear. But influence alone wasn't the issue. It was direction, where they were guiding him toward, and more importantly, who they were guiding him away from. That evening, I received another call from Vanessa. "Just a quick reminder about Saturday," she said brightly. "Cocktail attire, nothing too formal." "I'll do my best," I replied softly. There was a slight pause. "You don't need to stress about anything," she added almost gently. "It's a very curated group." Curated. I almost smiled. Of course it was. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in my living room watching the light shift through the windows. I thought about Michael, about the years we spent building something in rooms like the ones I was about to enter again, and I thought about how easily people confuse silence with weakness. The gathering was held at a private residence in one of the city's older, affluent neighborhoods. The house was impressive in the way wealth often is when it has had time to mature less about excess, more about control. Everything looked intentional. Nothing felt accidental. As I arrived, I could already feel it, the subtle energy of observation. Guests were scattered across the backyard holding drinks, exchanging conversations that sounded casual but were carefully layered with status and positioning. And at the center of it all, the Harpers. Richard stood near a group of men discussing real estate trends. Eleanor was engaged in a conversation with two women I recognized from their social circle. Vanessa moved through the crowd with practiced ease, laughing softly at the right moments. Daniel spotted me first. "Mom?" he said, approaching quickly. He looked uncertain, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware. "Hey," he added, lowering his voice. "Glad you came." "Of course," I said, gently. Vanessa appeared beside him almost immediately, placing a light hand on his arm. "Hi, Crystal," she said with a bright smile. "You made it." "I did," I replied. She leaned in slightly, her tone warm but precise. "It's a bit busy, but just relax and enjoy yourself." Relax, as if I were tense, as if I didn't belong unless instructed otherwise. "I will," I said softly. Daniel excused himself briefly to greet another guest, leaving Vanessa and me standing together. For a moment, she simply looked at me, not openly hostile, not warm either. Evaluating. "You look nice," she said finally. "Thank you," I replied. Another pause. Then almost casually she added, "Richard mentioned that Daniel might be considering some financial restructuring soon." I tilted my head slightly. "Oh." She smiled. "Just planning ahead. You know how important that is in families like ours." "Families like ours. Not ours." I nodded slowly. "Planning is important." "Exactly," she said. And then she walked away. I watched her go, the smile still on her face as she rejoined a group of guests. That was when I noticed it. Not one thing, but several, small patterns. Daniel being subtly guided away from certain conversations. Eleanor steering discussions toward independence and separation. Richard speaking with financial advisors who were not part of Daniel's usual circle. This wasn't just a gathering, it was alignment. They were consolidating influence, positioning themselves as the primary framework around Daniel's future decisions. And I was being placed outside of it, deliberately. As I moved through the edge of the crowd, I heard fragments of conversations carefully phrased, strategically vague. Stability requires boundaries. Family dynamics can complicate things. Best to establish clarity early. Each sentence a small brick being placed into a wall I was not meant to cross. Then I saw Daniel again. He was speaking with Richard now. Richard had his usual composed posture, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing slightly as he spoke. Daniel nodded occasionally. But I noticed something else. Hesitation. Not disagreement. Not yet. But something softer. Uncertainty. And then Richard said something that made Daniel glance briefly in my direction. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I already understood the direction. I felt it before Daniel even started walking toward me. "Mum," he said quietly when he reached me. "Can we talk for a minute?" Something in his tone tightened my chest. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. I nodded. Of course. He led me slightly away from the crowd toward a quieter corner of the garden. And there, away from the carefully constructed noise of the gathering, he finally said it. "Vanessa thinks it might be better if you had your own space," he said carefully, "closer to where you feel comfortable." There it was, the first formal step. Not a demand, not yet. A suggestion, wrapped in concern. But it was no longer subtle. "They think it would help everyone focus on the future," he added quickly, as if filling the silence. I looked at him for a long moment, and I saw it. Not cruelty, not malice, but influence. Layered, persistent, effective. "I understand," I said softly. Relief flickered across his face, and that more than anything confirmed what I needed to know. They weren't just influencing him anymore. They were guiding decisions that directly affected me. And Daniel was beginning to accept it without question. I nodded again slowly. "Let me think about it," I said gently. He seemed relieved. "Okay," he said. "Take your time." As he walked back toward the crowd, I stood alone for a moment, watching the gathering continue as if nothing had changed. But everything had, because now I knew the direction they were moving. And more importantly, I knew I was running out of time to decide how to respond. I left the Harper gathering earlier than I intended that night. Not abruptly, not dramatically. I stayed long enough to be polite, to smile when spoken to nod at the right moments. But something had shifted inside me, and I no longer had the patience to remain in a space where every conversation felt like it was quietly rearranging my place in Daniel's life. By the time I got home, the house felt different too. Not physically, emotionally, as if the outside world had begun to seep into its walls. I placed my purse on the counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. Daniel's words kept repeating in my mind. It might be better if you had your own space. Not a demand. Not yet. But it was the first step in a direction that had been carefully prepared for me long before I even realized there was a path forming. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table. That's when I allowed myself to stop performing. Not for them, not for Daniel, just for myself. The truth was simple, and I couldn't avoid it anymore. The Harpers were not improvising. They were executing a plan, and I had become an obstacle they believed was manageable. That realization didn't anger me immediately. It clarified things. There's a difference. Anger clouds judgment. Clarity sharpens it. And I needed to be sharp now, because what they were doing wasn't just about preference or family structure. It was about control, slow, incremental control that didn't look like control unless you knew what to look for. And I did. The next morning, I noticed the change immediately in Daniel's behavior. It wasn't obvious at first glance. It rarely is. He called me earlier than usual. "Mom, are you busy today?" he asked. "No," I replied gently. "Vanessa thought maybe we could all have lunch together," he said. "Just to talk about things." Of course, I said. There was a pause. Are you okay with that? He added. The question itself told me everything. He was no longer just coordinating plans, he was checking for approval. I smiled slightly, though he couldn't see it. I'm always happy to spend time with you, I said. Good, he replied, sounding relieved. I'll pick you up at noon. After we hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. Something had changed, not just in him, in the structure around him. Vanessa was no longer subtly influencing decisions. She was actively participating in them, and Daniel was beginning to adapt to that dynamic without questioning its origin. By noon, he arrived with Vanessa. She stepped out of the car first, smiling brightly as if nothing was out of place. Hi, Crystal, she said warmly. Hello, dear, I replied. Daniel hugged me briefly before opening the car door for me. The restaurant was upscale but quiet, another carefully chosen environment where conversations could feel relaxed while still being controlled. Vanessa ordered for all of us. Daniel didn't object. Neither did I. At first, the conversation stayed light. Work, travel, small updates about wedding planning. But I noticed something new. Whenever I spoke, Vanessa often redirected the conversation. Not rudely, not openly, but consistently. If I mentioned something about Daniel's childhood, she would smile politely and shift the topic. If I asked a question about their future plans, she would answer quickly and move on. Daniel followed her lead more often than mine. It was subtle, but unmistakable. At one point, I reached for my water glass, and Vanessa said, casually, "We've been talking about simplifying things after the wedding." Daniel nodded. Yeah, just trying to reduce stress overall. Stress from what I asked, gently. Vanessa smiled. Just life logistics. You know how complicated things can get when too many people are involved. Too many people, not too many opinions. People. I understood the implication immediately. I looked at Daniel. He avoided my gaze for a moment, then said, "It's just about making things easier, Mom." Easier. For whom I didn't ask. Not yet. Because I was watching something more important unfold. Daniel wasn't being forced. He was being guided into agreement. That was more effective and far more dangerous. After lunch, Vanessa suggested Daniel drop me home while she ran an errand. It was just the two of us in the car. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "Vanessa really wants everything to be organized early. She gets stressed easily." "I understand," I said. "She just thinks it's better if we set clear boundaries," he continued. "Boundaries are important," I replied softly. He glanced at me briefly. "You're not upset, right?" he asked. That question again. Always checking, always adjusting. "I'm not upset," I said. And I meant it, not in the way he feared, but something inside me was beginning to settle into a different kind of resolve, because now I could see the full shape of what was happening. This wasn't just about Vanessa's influence, it was about alignment. Richard and Eleanor were reinforcing a narrative, Vanessa was implementing it, and Daniel was being positioned within it, as someone transitioning away from me, not through conflict, through normalization. By the time we reached my house, Daniel seemed more relaxed, as if the conversation had reassured him. That worried me more than anything else, because reassurance built on incomplete truth is fragile, and eventually it collapses. "Thanks for lunch, Mum," he said. "Anytime, sweetheart," I replied. He hesitated before leaving the car, then said, "We're just trying to do what's best for everyone." "I know," I said softly. And I did. That was what made it so dangerous. People rarely recognize manipulation when it arrives wrapped in good intentions. After he left, I stood in my living room for a long time, staring out the window without really seeing anything. The pattern was now undeniable. They were preparing for separation, not emotional, structural. slowly removing me from proximity, from decisions, from influence. And Daniel wasn't resisting because he didn't see it as removal. He saw it as organization. That was the most effective kind of strategy, one that convinced the target they were participating willingly. I walked to my desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a small folder, old documents, records I hadn't touched in years, not because I had forgotten them, but because I hadn't needed them. Until now. I placed the folder on the table and sat down. There was a point in every situation like this where observation had to turn into action. But timing mattered. Too early and you expose yourself. Too late and you lose control of the outcome entirely. The Harpers believed they were shaping Daniel's future, and in a way they were, but they had made one critical assumption, that I would remain passive while they did it. I closed the folder gently. No, I whispered to myself. That's not how this ends. Because now I understood their rhythm. And more importantly, I understood how far they were willing to go. The only question left was how far I would let them go before I stopped them. The next shift didn't come from a confrontation. It came from distance. Subtle at first, so subtle that most people would have missed it completely. But I didn't. Daniel stopped calling me in the mornings. Not entirely. Not suddenly. Just less often. A day would pass, then another. Then I would receive a short message instead of his voice. Busy today, Mom. Talk later. 3 words. Polite. Distant. Controlled. And every time I replied, I kept my tone unchanged. Warm. Soft, unbothered, because I was watching the pattern, not reacting to it. Patterns don't lie. People do. It wasn't just Daniel either. Vanessa had begun adjusting the rhythm of our interactions with increasing confidence. She would answer for him when I asked him direct questions. She would summarize his thoughts before he spoke them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began replacing his voice in conversations where I used to hear him clearly. It's a strange thing to witness someone you raised slowly lose the habit of speaking for themselves in your presence. Not because they are silenced, but because someone else speaks faster, more decisively, more convincingly. And Daniel, who had always preferred harmony over confrontation, allowed it. I noticed it most clearly one evening when he came by alone. He looked tired again, not physically this time, but mentally stretched thin. "Mom," he said, as he stepped inside, "we need to talk about something." My body stayed still, but my attention sharpened. "Of course," I said gently. He hesitated before sitting down across from me. Vanessa wasn't with him. That alone told me this conversation had been rehearsed elsewhere. Vanessa thinks, he started, then paused as if correcting himself. We think it might be better if things are more structured. Structured. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded slowly. In what way? He exhaled. Just living arrangements, future planning. So nothing feels uncertain, interesting, because what they were actually doing was removing uncertainty for themselves. Not for me. I understand wanting clarity, I said softly. Daniel looked relieved immediately. That's good, he said quickly. We just don't want misunderstandings later. I would never want that either, I replied. And it was true. Misunderstandings only happen when intentions are unclear, and theirs were becoming clearer by the day. He leaned forward slightly. Vanessa also thinks it might be easier if we started making decisions without too much outside influence. Outside influence. The phrase landed exactly where I expected it to, not as an accusation, but as a classification. I didn't react. Instead, I tilted my head slightly. Outside influence, I repeated gently. That sounds very formal. He nodded as if grateful I wasn't resisting. Yeah, it's not personal, he said quickly. It's just about keeping things simple. Simple. Always simple. Simple is what people call it when they want fewer voices in a decision, especially when one of those voices belongs to someone they are learning to see as optional. I see, I said, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to become uncomfortable with it. Then I smiled softly. You're growing into your own life, Daniel. That's what matters. Relief washed over his expression instantly. That's exactly what I want you to understand, he said. I nodded. I do. But what I didn't say was this: I understood far more than he realized. After he left, I didn't sit down right away. I stood in the center of the room replaying every detail of that conversation. He wasn't acting out of cruelty. He wasn't rejecting me. That would have been simpler. Instead, he was being gradually repositioned, shifted, redirected. And the most dangerous part, he believed it was his own idea. That evening, I received a message from Vanessa. Hope Daniel wasn't too serious earlier. We're just trying to make things smooth for everyone. The smile at the end was intentional, softening, disguising. I stared at it for a long moment before replying, "No worries at all, dear. I trust you both." And that was the truth they needed me to maintain. Trust. Because trust keeps people relaxed, and relaxed people stop noticing details. The next development came 2 days later. Daniel didn't come alone this time. He came with Vanessa. And with him came something I hadn't seen before, a printed document. He placed it carefully on my kitchen table. "Mom," he said, his voice more formal than usual, "we've been working on something." Vanessa stood slightly behind him, arms folded gently, her posture calm. "We thought it might help clarify expectations," she added. Expectations. I looked at the document without touching it yet. "What is this?" I asked softly. Daniel cleared his throat. "It's just a draft arrangement," he said, "about future living situations and financial independence guidelines." Financial independence guidelines? I almost smiled. Because the wording was so carefully chosen, it was almost artistic. Not a demand, not a restriction, a framework, a suggestion wrapped in authority. Vanessa stepped forward slightly. "It's nothing official," she said. "Just something we all agreed would reduce confusion later." We all agreed. I noted that carefully because I hadn't agreed to anything. I finally picked up the document. It was structured neatly. Sections, clauses, bullet points. But the message beneath it was simple: define Crystal Collins out of dependency circles. Redirect Daniel's financial autonomy away from shared family influence. Establish physical separation post-marriage. Minimize external emotional obligations. External emotional obligations. That was me. Not named, but clearly referenced. I placed the document back on the table gently. Daniel watched my reaction closely. Vanessa watched even more closely than he did, waiting, expecting hesitation, or resistance, or confusion. Instead, I nodded slowly. "This is very thorough," I said softly. Relief flickered across Daniel's face again. Vanessa's posture loosened almost imperceptibly. "We just want everything to be clear," Daniel said. "I understand," I replied. Then I looked at both of them. "You've put a lot of thought into this." Vanessa smiled slightly. "We have." And there it was. Ownership. Not just of the document, but of the direction. I set my hands lightly on the table. "I appreciate being included," I said gently. And that was the moment something shifted again, because they expected more questions, more pushback, more emotion. Instead, I gave them acceptance, carefully measured acceptance. Daniel exhaled tension, leaving his shoulders. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. Vanessa nodded. We really just want harmony. Harmony, another word people use when they are controlling the volume of certain voices in a room. After they left, I remained at the table long after the house had gone quiet again. I didn't reread the document. I didn't need to. I already understood its purpose. What I needed now was not information. It was timing. Because they had made their next move, and in doing so, they had revealed something important. They believed I was already stepping back, that I was adjusting, accommodating, accepting the new structure of my absence. And that belief was the opening I had been waiting for. I finally stood and placed the document back exactly where Daniel had left it. Then I whispered almost to myself, "Now I see how far you're willing to go." And more importantly, I knew it was time to show them how far I was willing to let them go before I stopped it. After Daniel and Vanessa left that day, I didn't immediately move. I stayed at the kitchen table staring at the document they had brought me, not reading it again, not analyzing it, just letting its existence settle into its proper place in my mind. Because once you stop reacting emotionally, you start seeing things for what they actually are. And what I was looking at now wasn't a family discussion, it was a structure, a carefully constructed framework designed to slowly remove me from Daniel's decision-making world without ever having to say the words, "You don't belong." That was the clever part. Nothing they were doing was technically wrong. Everything was phrased as concern, clarity, planning, harmony. But beneath all of that was direction. Control always prefers soft language. It makes resistance feel unreasonable. I finally stood up, folded the document neatly, and placed it back on the table exactly where Daniel had left it, not because I agreed with it, but because I wanted them to believe I did. That night, I made a decision. If they were going to continue building their version of Daniel's future, then I needed to see every piece of it clearly, not from the outside, from within. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called someone from my past. "Thomas," I said when the voice answered. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a familiar steady tone replied, "Crystal Collins, I was wondering when you'd call again." Thomas Reed was not just a lawyer. He was someone I had worked with during the final years of Michael's firm, someone who understood financial structures, family dynamics, and most importantly, how influence is often disguised as legality. "I need advice," I said simply. That alone was enough for him to shift into focus. "I'm listening," he replied. I explained everything, not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. The gradual isolation, the document, the shifting influence over Daniel, the language they were using. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Thomas spoke. "They're not attacking you directly," he said slowly. "They're reshaping your access point." "My access point," I repeated. "Your son," he clarified. That word landed heavier than I expected, not because it was surprising, but because it was accurate. "They're creating a system where your influence is categorized as external," he continued. "Once that label is accepted, everything you say becomes optional in his mind." Optional. That was the danger. Not rejection. Irrelevance. "What do?" I asked. Another pause. Then Thomas said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "You don't confront a system that's still forming," he said. "You let it complete itself, so it reveals its weaknesses." I understood immediately. He wasn't telling me to act aggressively. He was telling me to observe longer, to let them continue believing they were succeeding, because systems built on control always contain assumptions, and assumptions can be exploited. After the call, I began paying closer attention, not just to Daniel, to everything around him. And the pattern became even clearer. Vanessa wasn't just influencing decisions, she was documenting agreement. Whenever Daniel hesitated, she would reframe his response. Whenever I was mentioned, she would soften or redirect the topic entirely. And Richard and Eleanor were reinforcing the structure from the outside, introducing language like independence planning and future stability models. They weren't acting independently, they were reinforcing roles. Daniel was being guided into a version of adulthood where emotional distance from me was framed as maturity, and I was being positioned as something stable but unnecessary, like an old habit that no longer fit the routine. The next turning point came 3 days later. Daniel called me in the afternoon. His tone was different this time, more careful, more rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "can you come over tonight? Vanessa and her parents will be here too." That alone told me this was not a casual visit. This was coordination. "I'll be there," I said. When I arrived, the atmosphere inside Daniel's home felt different. Not warm, not hostile, structured. Richard and Eleanor were already seated when I walked in. Vanessa stood near Daniel holding a folder. And Daniel looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision he hadn't fully made himself. "Thank you for coming, Crystal," Richard said smoothly. I nodded politely. "Of course." Eleanor gestured toward the seating area. "We wanted to finalize a few things regarding the future," she said. Finalize. A word that implies completion. I sat down slowly. Vanessa opened the folder, and there it was again, the same document from before, but expanded, more detailed, more formal. Daniel spoke first. "We've been talking more seriously about living arrangements after the wedding," he said. "I see," I replied softly. Vanessa took over. "We think it's important for everyone to have defined space," she said. "So expectations are clear." Richard added, "This reduces long-term complications." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And ensures emotional balance." Emotional balance. They were building a language system, a shared vocabulary that made exclusion sound rational. Daniel looked at me now, waiting, not for approval, but for confirmation that I understood, that I would not disrupt what they had built. I glanced at the document again, then back at him. "I understand your reasoning," I said gently. The relief in the room was immediate, almost visible, but I wasn't finished. "I do have one question," I added. Vanessa tensed slightly. "Of course." I looked at her first, then Richard, then Eleanor. "And where exactly," I said softly, "do you expect Daniel to fit into your structure if his decisions begin to differ from yours?" Silence. Not loud, not dramatic, but sharp. Daniel shifted in his seat. "That's not what this is about," he said quickly. "Isn't it?" I asked gently. Eleanor stepped in immediately. "We're simply trying to create stability," she said. "Stability for whom I asked." The question hung in the air longer than any of them expected. Vanessa spoke again, more carefully this time. "For everyone," she said. I nodded slowly. "Then I'm sure we'll all adjust accordingly." That answer seemed to satisfy them. But I saw something shift in Daniel's expression. Not clarity, not yet, but discomfort. A small crack in something that had been carefully reinforced around him. As the meeting ended, Richard stood first. "Thank you for understanding, Crystal," he said. "I always try to," I replied softly. Vanessa hugged Daniel. Eleanor nodded politely at me, and then they left, leaving only Daniel and me in the quiet house. He didn't speak immediately, neither did I. Finally, he said, "Mom, are you really okay with all of this?" I looked at him, really looked at him, at the confusion, the tension, the divided loyalty, and I realized something important. He wasn't fully lost. Not yet. He was just surrounded. "I'm always okay, Daniel," I said gently. "That doesn't mean I don't notice things." He frowned slightly. "What things?" I smiled faintly. "That sometimes people think they're building clarity when they're actually building distance." He didn't respond, but I saw it, the beginning of doubt, and that was enough, because doubt is where systems begin to break. After that night, something shifted in Daniel, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed immediately, but I noticed, because I had always been the one who noticed things others missed. He still came by, he still called, he still followed through on plans, but the pauses between his words grew longer, the certainty in his tone became softer, as if he was no longer entirely sure which version of reality he was supposed to be speaking from. And that, more than anything, told me the influence around him was beginning to fracture, not break, but strain under its own weight. Vanessa noticed too. Of course she did. People like her always notice when control starts to loosen. The difference is they react faster. 2 days after the meeting, she invited me to lunch alone. No Daniel, no Richard, just her. The restaurant was quiet, modern, carefully chosen again. Everything about Vanessa's choices now felt like placement rather than preference. She arrived first, already seated when I walked in. "Crystal," she said with a smile that looked practiced but slightly tighter than usual. "Thanks for coming." "Of course, dear," I replied, sitting across from her. For a few moments, she didn't speak. She stirred her drink unnecessarily, watched me, then finally said, "I think there's been some confusion lately." I tilted my head slightly. "Confusion?" She nodded. "About expectations, about boundaries, about roles in Daniel's life." Roles. That word again. I stayed silent, letting her continue. She leaned forward slightly. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page," she said carefully, "because sometimes outside perspectives can make things more complicated than they need to be." Outside perspectives. I almost smiled. They were refining their language again. Eleanor's influence, I suspected. "I understand wanting clarity," I said softly. Vanessa exhaled slightly, as if relieved I wasn't resisting. "Good," she said quickly, "because I really do care about Daniel, and I want to make sure we're building something stable." "Stability is important," I agreed. She studied me for a moment longer, then added more cautiously, "It might be easier if things stayed consistent. Emotionally, logistically. Consistent, meaning predictable, meaning controlled." I nodded again. "I don't want to disrupt anything," I said gently. That seemed to satisfy her, but I noticed something interesting. She didn't look relieved this time. She looked unsure, as if my compliance was not producing the reaction she expected, as if she had prepared for resistance and not gotten it. That small misalignment mattered more than she realized, because control systems rely on predictable responses, and I was no longer providing one. After lunch, she left quickly. No extended goodbye, no lingering conversation, just a polite smile and a brief touch on Daniel's arm when she saw him later that day. But Daniel didn't look reassured this time. He looked more conflicted. That evening, he came to my house again, but this time he didn't sit immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if deciding whether to enter at all. "Mom," he said finally, "can I ask you something, honestly?" "Always," I replied. He stepped inside slowly. "I feel like—" He paused, searching for words. "I feel like there are two different conversations happening." I didn't respond immediately because I knew exactly what he meant. He continued, "One with Vanessa and her parents, and one with you." He looked at me now, confused, torn, and I don't know which one is real anymore. There it was, the fracture, not just in influence, but in perception. I gestured for him to sit. He did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said softly, "Daniel, let me ask you something." He nodded slightly. "When you are with them," I continued, "do you feel like you are deciding things, or agreeing with things already decided. The question landed. I could see it immediately, not in words, in his posture, in the subtle tightening of his expression. I don't know, he admitted. That was important. I think. He hesitated. I think I'm just trying to keep everyone happy. There it was, the core of it. Not manipulation in the obvious sense, but emotional negotiation. I understand, I said gently. And I did, better than he knew. Daniel had always been someone who valued peace over confrontation, harmony over conflict. But that strength becomes vulnerability in environments where clarity is replaced with subtle pressure, especially when that pressure is consistent. I don't want to feel like I'm choosing sides, he said quietly. You shouldn't have to, I replied. He looked up at me. But it feels like I am. I nodded slowly. That feeling is important, I said. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I leaned forward just a little. Sometimes, I said carefully, people don't force you to choose directly. They simply make one option feel more reasonable than the other. Silence. Not rejection, not agreement, just processing. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Vanessa showed me the documents again, he admitted. My attention sharpened immediately. The ones about living arrangements, I asked softly. He nodded. She said it would help avoid confusion, he said. But it felt more like... He stopped. Like what I asked gently. Like deciding where people belong before anything even happens, he said finally. There it was. Clarity breaking through the conditioning, not fully formed, but emerging. I didn't push him. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I simply said, it's okay to question things that are presented as final. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. I just don't want anyone to get hurt, he said. That was Daniel. Even now, still trying to protect everyone at once. I know, I said softly, and I did. But protection without awareness is exactly what makes people easy to guide. After he left, I sat in silence again. But this time the silence felt different because something had changed. Daniel wasn't fully aligned with them anymore, but he wasn't free either. He was suspended between interpretations. And in that space, influence becomes most effective. The next morning confirmed it. A message from Richard Harper arrived on Daniel's phone while he was at work. He showed it to me later that day. Unintentionally. Or maybe not. It read, just ensuring we're aligned on upcoming decisions. Stability depends on consistency. Daniel stared at it for a long time, then said quietly, why does everything feel like it has to be approved now? He wasn't angry. He was waking up, slowly, unsteadily, but unmistakably. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a very small certainty. They were no longer just shaping the system. They were beginning to lose control of it. The first real fracture didn't come from Daniel. It came from a mistake. And mistakes in systems like this are never small. They are exposed pressure points. It happened on a Thursday morning. Daniel came to my house earlier than usual, looking unsettled in a way I had not seen before, not confused like before, not divided, disturbed. He didn't even sit down right away. Mom, he said, holding his phone in his hand. I think something's wrong. I set my tea aside slowly. What happened? I asked. He hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. A banking notification, followed by a transaction history. At first glance, it looked ordinary routine financial activity transfers between accounts, scheduled payments, but Daniel's expression told me he had already seen what I was looking for. These transfers, he said quietly, I didn't authorize them. I studied the screen carefully. There it was, a structured movement of funds, consistent, timed, almost administrative in its precision, but not initiated by him. Vanessa said it was just organizing shared expenses, he added, but I never agreed to this. Silence settled between us, not heavy, not emotional, focused, because this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This was about access. Did she explain how it was set up? I asked gently. He shook his head. She said Richard helped set it up through their financial advisor, he replied. But I never signed anything. That was the moment I understood the shape of the problem completely. This wasn't just influence, this was infrastructure. They hadn't just been guiding Daniel's decisions, they had been building systems around him that functioned with or without his active participation. And he hadn't noticed because the language used was never alarming. Convenience, efficiency, shared responsibility, words designed to remove scrutiny. Daniel paced slightly now. I don't like this, he said. It feels like I'm being managed. Managed. Not controlled. Not yet. That distinction mattered because managed still sounds temporary, still sounds reversible. I stood up slowly. Show me everything, I said. He hesitated, then handed me his phone. As I went through the records, the pattern became clearer. Multiple small adjustments, account linkages, authorization updates, all framed as administrative improvements, all routed through external advisors connected to the Harper family, and none of it ever directly highlighted for Daniel's explicit approval in a way that would have triggered resistance. It was elegant, deliberate, and very, very familiar. Mum, Daniel said quietly, watching my expression. Is this normal? I didn't answer immediately, because the answer mattered, not just for truth, but for timing. No, I said finally. It's not normal. His face tightened slightly. So what is it? I looked at him. This, I said carefully, is what happens when decisions are made faster than understanding can catch up. He sat down now slowly. Vanessa said it was just to make things easier, he said again, as if repeating it might stabilize it. I nodded gently. I'm sure that's how it was presented, I replied. But presentation and intention are not the same thing, and Daniel was beginning to see that gap for the first time. That afternoon, he called Vanessa. I didn't interfere. I didn't guide him. I simply observed. His voice was controlled at first, careful, but it changed as the conversation went on. I didn't approve this, I heard him say. A pause, then softer. I just want to understand why my accounts were adjusted without me knowing. Another pause, then his posture shifted slightly. No, I'm not accusing anyone. I just want transparency. Transparency. That word was new in his vocabulary in this context. I could hear Vanessa's voice faintly through the speaker. Not clear words, but tone. Careful, defensive. And then I heard something else. Richard. His voice entered the conversation through speakerphone or proximity, I couldn't tell, but his tone was immediately different. Structured, confident. Daniel, he said, these are standard practices for couples preparing for shared financial futures. Couples, not individuals. That framing again. Daniel looked at me briefly, then back at the phone. I'm not comfortable with changes I didn't approve, he said. A pause. Then Richard replied more firmly now. Comfort isn't always aligned with long-term stability. That sentence landed differently. I could see it in Daniel's face. He was no longer just hearing words. He was hearing structure being enforced. I need time to think, Daniel said finally. And then he ended the call. The silence that followed was different from before, because this time something had been confirmed, not assumed. Confirmed. Daniel placed the phone down slowly. They've been doing more than I realized, he said quietly. I nodded. Yes, I replied. He looked at me, not defensively now, but searching. Why didn't I see it earlier? That was the question that always comes. Not what is happening, But why didn't I notice? I answered carefully. Because it wasn't designed to be obvious, I said. It was designed to feel normal. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I trusted them, he said. That's not a mistake, I replied gently. Trust is supposed to exist. But it feels like I gave it too easily, he said. I watched him carefully. No, I said softly. It feels that way now because information has changed. That distinction mattered, and I needed him to understand it. Trust is not betrayal. Misalignment is. Later that evening, I received a message from Vanessa. Not emotional, not apologetic, just precise. We think there may be some misunderstanding regarding financial coordination. We'd like to clarify things soon. Clarify. Another word that sounds neutral, but never is. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I think clarity would be beneficial, I wrote. And I meant it, because now the system was no longer hidden. It was exposed, and exposed systems behave differently. They tighten, they accelerate, they make decisions faster, because they feel time slipping, and that is when they make their biggest mistakes. After I sent the message, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. Daniel was no longer fully under their influence, but he wasn't fully free either. He was in transition, and transitions are unstable. For systems like the Harper's, instability is dangerous because it forces escalation, and escalation always reveals intention. Now I just had to wait for theirs. The call came 2 days later, but it wasn't a call this time. It was an invitation, formal, carefully worded, delivered by Vanessa herself. We'd like to have a family meeting, she said. All of us, in one place, to clear everything up properly. Her tone was calm, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Pressure. Not panic. Not yet. But urgency dressed as organization. Daniel looked at me when he heard her words on speakerphone. He didn't answer immediately. Neither did I. Because we both understood, even if we didn't say it aloud, that this was no longer about clarification. This was containment. We think it's important to resolve misunderstandings before they grow, Richard added through the call. Misunderstandings. That word again. Always convenient. Always protective. Of course, I said gently. When were you thinking? Tonight, Vanessa replied quickly. That was the first real crack in their control language. Not whenever convenient. Not next week. Tonight. Urgency always appears when control feels threatened. I'll be there, I said simply. Daniel hesitated. I should come too, he said finally. Good, Richard responded immediately. That's exactly why we're doing this. Exactly. The word of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. But I noticed something in Daniel's expression after the call ended. He wasn't reassured. He was alert, and that difference mattered. A few hours later, we arrived at the Harper residence. This time, the atmosphere was different. Not welcoming, not performative warmth, structured seriousness. Eleanor opened the door herself. Her smile was present, but thin. Come in, she said. Inside the living room had been arranged differently, seating positioned deliberately, equal spacing, no casual flow. This wasn't a conversation space. It was a controlled environment. Richard stood near the fireplace, Vanessa by the window, a triangle formation, and Daniel and I were placed into it. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't gathering opinions, they were delivering conclusions. Let's keep this straightforward, Richard began. Daniel looked at me briefly, then back at them. I just want transparency, he said calmly. Vanessa nodded. Of course, she replied. That's why we're here. Eleanor stepped forward slightly. There have been concerns about financial misunderstandings, she said. I tilted my head slightly. Concerns from whom I asked softly. A pause, small but real, from Vanessa, from Richard, from Eleanor. All at once, Daniel noticed it too, that synchronization. Richard recovered quickly. From everyone involved, he said. Interesting phrasing, because it erased origin, and therefore accountability. Daniel spoke again. I didn't authorize changes to my accounts, he said firmly. Vanessa responded immediately. Daniel, those were administrative updates meant to streamline shared responsibilities. Streamline. Another soft control word. Daniel shook his head. I don't want my accounts changed without my consent. Eleanor stepped in now. Sometimes, she said gently, family systems require flexibility. Family systems, not relationships. Systems. That word revealed more than they realized. I watched Daniel carefully. He was no longer just listening, he was comparing. Language versus intent, explanation versus experience. That gap was widening. Richard stepped forward slightly. This is about long-term stability, he said, and ensuring that external influences don't create unnecessary tension. External influences, now fully articulated, not implied, not suggested, named. Daniel looked at him directly. Are you referring to my mother? He asked. Silence. Not immediate, but deliberate. Vanessa spoke first. Not in a personal way, she said quickly, just in terms of structural clarity. Structural clarity. I almost smiled. They were repeating themselves now, because repetition is what people do when they believe language still holds authority. Daniel turned slightly toward me, and for the first time in all of this, I saw something different in his eyes. Not confusion, not compliance, awareness. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about any of this? I met his gaze calmly. No, I said. That was all I needed to say. Because I didn't need to defend myself. I needed him to see the pattern without interference. Richard stepped forward again. This isn't about exclusion, he said firmly. It's about ensuring stability in your future decisions. But Daniel interrupted him. My decisions, he said, not loud, but clear. A shift. Vanessa immediately adjusted. Of course, she said softly, we're just helping organize things so you're not overwhelmed. Overwhelmed? Another assumption layered over him. Daniel shook his head slightly. I don't feel overwhelmed, he said. That was the first time he directly rejected their framing. The room tightened instantly, not visibly, but perceptibly. Eleanor's smile faded slightly. Richard's posture stiffened. Vanessa looked at Daniel more carefully now, like recalculating. And that was the moment I realized something important. The system they built depended on Daniel's passivity, and he was no longer fully passive. I didn't intervene, not yet, because intervention would collapse the process too early, and I needed the truth to fully surface. Daniel continued. I think decisions about my life should come from me, he said. Silence. Longer this time. Then Richard responded. Of course they do, he said carefully, but informed decisions require context. Daniel nodded slowly. I agree, he said. Then he looked at me. And I think I'm finally getting context. That was the fracture point, not confrontation, recognition. Vanessa stepped forward slightly. Daniel, we're just trying to help you avoid confusion, she said. But her tone had changed, less confident, more precise. Daniel looked at her. I think the confusion was already created before I started asking questions, he said quietly. That landed. I saw it in her face. The first moment she realized the narrative wasn't holding the way it used to. Eleanor tried to recover. Crystal, she said, turning to me, you understand, we only want what's best for Daniel. I nodded gently. I believe you believe that, I said. That distinction mattered, because belief and behavior are not the same thing. Richard stepped forward one last time. This meeting was meant to bring clarity, he said. Daniel looked at him directly. I think it did, he replied. Then he stood up, slowly, not aggressively, but decisively. I'm going to handle my own financial matters from now on, he said. A pause. I'll review everything myself. Vanessa opened her mouth slightly, but didn't speak. Richard didn't respond immediately. Eleanor didn't either, because none of them had prepared for refusal at that stage. Daniel turned to me. Mum, he said softly, let's go. And we did. We left the Harper house without another word. Behind us, silence didn't feel like calm. It felt like recalculation, because systems like theirs don't break easily. They adapt. But adaptation requires time, and for the first time, they no longer had full control over Daniel's interpretation of reality, and that changed everything. We didn't speak much on the drive home. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road, jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen before. Not tense like confusion, but focused like someone trying to hold a newly formed truth in place so it wouldn't slip away. I didn't interrupt that silence. Some silences need to settle before they can be understood. Outside the window, the city moved normally. Lights, traffic, people going about their lives, completely unaware that something small but irreversible had just shifted inside one family. Inside Daniel. Inside me. When we finally reached my house, he parked but didn't immediately turn off the engine. Mom, he said quietly. I turned toward him. Yes. He hesitated, then exhaled. I think I've been letting other people define things for me. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I nodded slowly. That happens when people you trust speak with confidence, I said gently. Confidence can sound like certainty even when it isn't. He looked at me then, not as someone asking for reassurance, but as someone trying to recalibrate his understanding of everything he had accepted recently. I don't like how it feels now, he admitted. I understood exactly what he meant. Because once you see the structure behind influence, it stops feeling like guidance and starts feeling like pressure you didn't notice building around you. You don't have to decide everything tonight, I said softly. He nodded, but his mind was clearly still moving. I told them I'd handle my own finances, he said. Yes, I replied. That's going to change things, he added. I paused. It already has, I said. That was the truth. Change doesn't begin when people react. It begins when assumptions stop working. He finally turned off the engine. We sat there for a moment longer before he spoke again. Do you think they were trying to control me? The question was direct, but fragile, because he wasn't just asking about them, he was asking about his own judgment. I chose my words carefully. I think I said slowly they were trying to structure your decisions in a way that made their input feel necessary. He absorbed that, then nodded slightly. That sounds less harsh, he said. It doesn't have to be harsh to be real, I replied. He leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face. I kept thinking I was just organizing my life, he said, being responsible. And you were, I said. That mattered, because the most effective influence doesn't convince people they are wrong. It convinces them they are improving. A long pause followed, then he said something quieter. I didn't realize how much Vanessa was speaking for me. That line stayed in the air longer than anything else that night, because once you notice someone speaking for you, you can never fully unnotice it again. The next few days were different, not chaotic, but unstable in a controlled way, like a system that had lost one of its central supports and was now quietly redistributing weight. Daniel stopped attending most of Vanessa's planned calls. He began reviewing his financial accounts personally. He asked questions that didn't exist before. Simple ones, then more detailed ones. Each question a small step away from acceptance. Vanessa, of course, noticed immediately. Her responses became more precise, less warm, more structured. She began sending longer messages instead of calling, messages that explained, justified, clarified. Richard stopped contacting Daniel directly. Instead, everything went through formal language, emails, summaries, statements framed as clarifications for mutual benefit. Eleanor withdrew socially but remained emotionally present through Vanessa, who now carried the full weight of their narrative. And I watched all of it unfold without interference because the system was no longer stable. It was compensating, and compensation always reveals what was previously hidden. One afternoon, Daniel came to my house again. This time, he looked different. Not uncertain, not conflicted, but alert. I found something else he said as he sat down. I waited. He opened his laptop and turned it toward me. There were permissions set on my account, he explained. Not just transfers, access levels, advisory controls. I studied the screen carefully. Structured financial permissions, tiered access, external advisory input linked to joint planning protocols. It was sophisticated and intentional. This wasn't just administrative, Daniel said quietly. No, I agreed. He looked at me. They were building a parallel decision layer, he said. I nodded slowly. Yes. He frowned. Why would they do that? That question mattered, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was uncomfortable. I leaned back slightly. Because it allows influence without confrontation, I said. If decisions feel like they come from multiple aligned sources, they feel less like pressure. He processed that slowly. So I wasn't really deciding alone, he said. No, I replied gently. But you believed you were part of the process. That distinction hit him harder than anything else. He closed the laptop. I trusted the structure, he said quietly. I looked at him. Most people do, I replied. Silence again. But this one was different. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was reconstruction. Daniel was rebuilding his internal framework of trust step by step. And rebuilding always requires tearing down first. Then he asked something I didn't expect. Did you know this would happen? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth wasn't simple. I knew I said finally that their approach was systematic. He nodded slowly. But you let it happen, he said. It wasn't accusation. It was processing. I met his gaze. Yes, I said. That honesty mattered more than defense. He looked away for a moment, then back. Why I chose my words carefully, because if I had stopped it too early, I said you would have believed I was the problem they were warning you about. He went quiet. That part I knew landed exactly where it needed to. He exhaled slowly. So you needed me to see it myself, he said. Yes, I replied. Another long pause, then he nodded once. I see it now, he said quietly. Not fully, not perfectly, but clearly enough. And that was the turning point, because clarity once reached cannot be easily reversed. That evening, Vanessa called him again. I was in the room when he answered. Her voice came through the speaker, carefully controlled, slightly strained now. Daniel, we need to revisit some of the financial arrangements, she said. He listened, then responded calmly. I've already made adjustments on my side. A pause. That wasn't the agreement, she said. I don't recall agreeing to the structure the way it's currently implemented, he replied. Another pause. Shorter. Sharper. Then Richard's voice entered briefly, firm and controlled. Daniel, this is becoming unnecessarily complicated. Daniel looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He turned back. No, he said quietly. It's becoming clear. Silence on the line. Not immediate response, not argument, just silence, because clarity disrupts systems built on assumed agreement. Then the call ended. Daniel placed the phone down slowly. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't look like someone being pulled in multiple directions. He looked like someone standing in one place, choosing. That was when I realized something important. The Harper structure wasn't collapsing loudly. It was dissolving where it mattered most in Daniel's acceptance. And once acceptance is removed, control has nowhere to stand. After the call ended that evening, the silence in my house felt different again. Not heavy like before, not tense, but settled, like a storm that had finally moved far enough away that you could hear what the world actually sounded like underneath it. Daniel didn't speak immediately. He sat on my couch, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as if replaying every layer of the conversation he had just had with Vanessa and Richard. Then he said quietly, "They're not going to stop easily." I nodded. "I don't think they know how to stop," I replied. That was the difference. People like the Harpers don't see influence as something they choose to apply. They see it as something they are responsible for maintaining, like structure, like order, like correction. Daniel finally leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I keep thinking about how normal it all felt," he said, "even when it wasn't." I understood that feeling too well. That's how most systems like this survive, not through force, but through familiarity. "They didn't rush you," I said gently. "They adjusted your environment until their version of normal became easier to follow than questioning it." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it feels like now," he admitted. A pause. Then he added, "I told Vanessa I'm stepping back from all shared financial decisions until I fully understand everything." I watched him carefully. "And how did she respond?" I asked. He hesitated. "She didn't argue," he said. "She just went quiet, like she wasn't expecting me to hold the line." That detail mattered, because silence in those moments is never neutral, it's recalculation. I leaned forward slightly. "That means you changed the dynamic," I said softly. He looked at me. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," he said. "Like what?" "Like I'm suddenly the one disrupting things," he said. I smiled faintly. "That's because you were never supposed to see yourself as the center of decision-making," I replied. "They positioned you as part of a system that already had direction." Daniel absorbed that slowly. "And now I'm outside of it," he said. "Now you're independent of it," I corrected gently. That distinction mattered. Outside suggests exclusion. Independent suggests agency. There is a difference in perception that changes everything. He stayed for a while longer before leaving, and after he went home, I sat alone in my living room again thinking about what came next. Because this stage was critical, when systems lose influence, they rarely retreat gracefully. They attempt re-entry through emotional channels, through guilt, through urgency, through reframing. And I knew Vanessa well enough now to expect all three. The next morning confirmed it. Daniel forwarded me a message from her. It was longer than before, more emotional, less structured. "We're concerned that things are being misunderstood. We never intended for you to feel excluded or pressured. Everything we've done has been for clarity and stability. Please, let's talk before anything becomes irreversible." Irreversible. That word was not accidental. It was designed to introduce fear, fear of permanent rupture, fear of consequences, fear of loss. I read it twice, then looked at Daniel. "She's shifting tone," I said. He nodded. "I noticed," he replied. From structure to emotion, I added, "Yeah," he said quietly. "It feels different." That was the point. When logical framing stops working, emotional framing begins, because emotional framing bypasses analysis. It goes straight to attachment. Daniel looked down at his phone again. I don't want this to become a war, he said. It doesn't have to, I replied. A pause. Then he asked, what do I do if she keeps pushing? I thought for a moment, then answered honestly. You stay consistent, I said. Not reactive, not defensive, just consistent. He nodded slowly. That's harder than it sounds, he admitted. I know, I said, softly, because consistency requires resisting emotional pull from multiple directions at once, and Daniel had spent most of his life doing the opposite, maintaining harmony by adjusting himself. Now he was learning something new, to hold position. 2 days later, Vanessa requested a private meeting, not with Daniel alone, with me included. The message was polite, almost formal again. I think it would be helpful for us to clear the air directly. No misunderstandings, just honest conversation. Daniel showed it to me before replying. What do you think, he asked. I studied the message carefully. This wasn't escalation, it was repositioning. They were trying to reintroduce authority through proximity. I think we should go, I said. He frowned slightly. Both of us? Yes, I replied. If we separate ourselves, they regain control over framing. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Let's do it. We met them at a quiet cafe, neutral space, but even there the structure of their approach was noticeable. Vanessa arrived first, Richard shortly after. Eleanor did not come. That was interesting. It meant they were narrowing the emotional delivery system, reducing variables. Vanessa smiled when she saw us, but it was softer now, carefully softened. Thank you for coming, she said. Daniel nodded. We're here to understand things better, he replied, a subtle shift. Not agreement, not acceptance, but positioning. We sat. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then Vanessa began. I think there's been a misunderstanding about intent, she said gently. Everything we've done has been about helping Daniel feel prepared for long-term stability. Daniel listened quietly, then responded. I understand your intent, he said, but intent doesn't override impact. That line landed. I saw it immediately. Vanessa's expression changed slightly, not defensive, not angry, but recalculating. Richard stepped in. Impact is often misinterpreted without full context, he said. Daniel shook his head lightly. I've seen the context, he said. That's why I'm stepping back. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but decisive. Vanessa looked at me then. For the first time directly. Crystal, she said softly, you must understand we never wanted distance. I met her gaze. I believe you didn't start with that intention, I said calmly. Her expression tightened slightly, but intention changed along the way, I continued. That was the truth they didn't want named. Richard spoke again, more firmly. This is becoming unnecessary division, he said. Daniel turned to him. No, he said quietly. This is correction. That word changed the air in the room. Correction, not conflict, not misunderstanding. Correction implies adjustment toward accuracy. Vanessa exhaled slowly. We just want Daniel to succeed, she said. I want that too, Daniel replied. Another pause. Then he added, but I define what success looks like for me. That was the moment everything stopped moving for them, because that statement removed the foundation of their entire system, external definition. Vanessa looked down briefly. Richard leaned back slightly. For the first time, they didn't respond immediately, because there was nothing left in their framework that could easily counter it. After a moment, Vanessa said softly, we'll need time to process this. Daniel nodded. Take it, he said. We left shortly after. No confrontation, no escalation, just separation. And that separation held weight, because systems built on influence don't collapse through argument. They collapse when participation stops. That evening, Daniel stood in my kitchen again, but this time his posture was different, more grounded, less reactive. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "What do you understand?" I asked. He looked at me. "That I was never forced," he said. But I was guided so consistently that I stopped noticing the direction. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. He exhaled. "And now I get to choose where I go next." That was the first time he said it like a statement instead of a question. I smiled faintly. "Yes," I replied. "You do." And for the first time since all of this began, the future no longer felt like something being arranged around him. It felt like something he could actually shape. The following week felt quieter than I expected, not because everything was resolved, but because the tension had changed shape. It was no longer inside Daniel, and it was no longer between us in the same immediate way. Instead, it existed at a distance, like something watching from the edge of a room that no longer had permission to enter directly. Vanessa didn't call. Richard didn't send new messages. Eleanor remained absent. At first, that silence felt like relief, but I've learned that silence in situations like this is rarely absence. It is preparation. Daniel noticed it too. One evening, he sat at my kitchen table staring at his phone longer than usual. "They're not reaching out," he said. I looked up from my tea. "And how does that make you feel?" I asked. He hesitated. "Strange," he admitted. "Like I'm waiting for something." I nodded slowly. "Because your nervous system is still expecting the pattern to continue," I said gently, "even when the pattern has changed." He leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly it," he said quietly. "It feels like I'm supposed to respond to something that isn't happening anymore." That was an important realization, because breaking influence is not only about rejecting external pressure, it is also about unlearning internal anticipation. A few days later, the next shift arrived. Not through Daniel, through Vanessa. She sent a long message, more emotional than before, less structured. "We never wanted to lose our relationship with you. Everything we did was meant to support Daniel, not separate him from his family. If boundaries were misunderstood, we are willing to adjust. We just want peace." Peace. A word that sounds final, but is often used when control begins to slip. Daniel read it silently, then handed me his phone. "I don't know how to respond to this," he said. I studied the message carefully. This was no longer influence through structure. It was re-entry through reconciliation framing. Softened language, shared blame, emotional repair attempt. "They're trying to re-establish access," I said quietly. Daniel frowned. "Access to what?" "To your emotional response," I replied. That was the part most people miss. Control systems don't only seek decisions, they seek emotional predictability. Daniel looked down. "I don't feel angry anymore," he said. "That's normal," I replied. "Anger burns quickly, clarity stays longer." He nodded slowly. "So what do I do now?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "Now," I said, "you stop responding to urgency disguised as emotion." He exhaled. "That sounds easier than it is," he admitted. "I know," I said. "Because emotional framing is powerful precisely because it feels human." That evening, Vanessa called. This time, Daniel answered on speaker. Her voice was softer than before, less confident. "Daniel," she said, "I think we got caught up in planning things too rigidly. I don't want you to feel controlled." He listened without interrupting. Then she added, "We just want to understand where we stand." Daniel looked at me. I gave a slight nod. He spoke. "Where I stand hasn't changed," he said calmly. "I make my own financial and personal decisions." A pause. Then Vanessa replied carefully, "Of course, we support that." But the tone didn't match the words. Daniel noticed. I appreciate that, he said, but I need consistency going forward. Another pause, shorter this time. We can do that, she said. Then Richard's voice entered briefly. Daniel, let's not let misunderstandings create long-term distance, Daniel responded calmly. It's not distance, he said, it's clarity. And then he ended the call. No escalation, no emotional reaction, just closure. Afterward, he sat quietly for a moment. I think they're adjusting, he said. Yes, I replied, but not resisting, he added. No, I said softly, they're adapting. And that distinction mattered because adaptation means recalculation, not surrender. A week later, something unexpected happened. Daniel received a formal invitation. Not casual, not emotional, structured. A dinner hosted by Richard and Eleanor. The purpose is reconciliation and forward alignment, it read. Daniel showed it to me immediately. What do you think, he asked? I read it carefully. This was not emotional re-entry anymore. This was strategic normalization. They want to reintroduce authority in a controlled environment, I said. He frowned. So they haven't accepted it yet? No, I replied. They've adjusted the method. He exhaled slowly. I should go, he said. I looked at him. Why? I asked gently. He thought for a moment. Because I want to see if they can respect boundaries in person, he said. That was growth, not reaction, observation. I nodded. Then go, I said, but stay aware of the difference between conversation and framing. He gave a small smile. I think I'm starting to see it now, he said. And that was enough. The dinner was held in a private dining room, formal setting, neutral lightings, everything arranged to suggest equality. But structure always reveals intention. Richard greeted Daniel warmly. Eleanor followed. Vanessa arrived last. All smiles, all carefully managed. The conversation began politely. Work, life, general updates, then gradually shifted. Richard spoke first. Daniel, he said, we've reflected on everything that's happened. Daniel nodded. I appreciate that, he said. Eleanor continued. We realize that structure may have felt restrictive, she said. May have felt. Carefully distancing language. Vanessa added softly, that was never our intention. Daniel listened, then responded. I understand your intention, he said, but I'm more focused on outcomes now. That shifted the room slightly. Richard adjusted. Outcomes are best achieved collaboratively, he said. Daniel shook his head gently. Collaboration requires equal input, he replied. Silence. Not tense, but precise. Vanessa looked at him carefully. We don't want to lose you from the family, she said quietly. That was the emotional pivot. But Daniel didn't react the way he used to. Instead, he said something calm. You're not losing me, he said. You're adjusting to me not being defined by external structure. That landed because it removed fear and replaced it with reality. Richard leaned back. For the first time, he looked less certain. Eleanor remained quiet. Vanessa's expression softened. Not manipulation now, but recognition that their system no longer functioned the same way. After dinner, Daniel and I left without conflict. No resolution speech, no final confrontation, just quiet departure. Outside, the night air felt different again. Not heavy, not uncertain, just open. Daniel walked beside me for a while before speaking. I think I understand something now, he said. What I asked. That influence only works when it feels like agreement, he said. I smiled slightly. Yes, I replied. He nodded. And once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. No, I agreed softly. You can't. We walked a little further. Then he said, I'm glad you didn't stop it for me. I turned to him slightly. You wouldn't have believed it if I did, I said gently. He nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I needed to see it break on its own. I stopped walking for a moment, then placed a hand lightly on his arm. You did more than see it, I said. You stepped out of it. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, his expression was steady, not conflicted, not divided, steady. I think I finally know what that feels like, he said. We stood there for a moment longer, then continued walking, not away from anything, but towards something that finally belonged only to him. And for me, that was enough. What happened with Daniel was never about one family trying to overpower another. It was about something far more subtle and far more common. Influence rarely begins as control. It begins as care, as organization, as protection. It uses language that feels responsible, even thoughtful. It rarely announces itself as authority. Instead, it slowly becomes the default framework through which decisions are made. The most dangerous part is not when someone is forced to comply. It is when they begin to believe that compliance is the same as cooperation. Daniel didn't lose himself overnight. He adjusted gradually, believing he was participating in a system that simply helped him stay on track. And the people around him reinforced that belief with consistency structure and emotional framing that made resistance feel unnecessary, even selfish. But systems built on subtle influence have one weakness: they depend on unchallenged acceptance. The moment that acceptance becomes awareness, the structure begins to fail, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably. What I learned through all of this is that clarity is not something you give someone. It is something they arrive at when the pattern becomes too consistent to ignore. Daniel didn't need to be rescued. He needed space to see the difference between guidance and control. And I needed patience to let that difference become visible. In the end, nothing was destroyed, but something was rebuilt differently. Boundaries became clearer. Roles became defined by choice rather than expectation. And most importantly, Daniel learned to recognize when agreement is genuine and when it is shaped. That kind of awareness doesn't just change a situation, it changes how a person moves through every future decision, and that is the real outcome that matters. What do you think about this situation? If you've ever seen influence like this in real life, how do you think it should be handled? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment, share where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories like this.